everyone. Today we're going to be discussing the civil rights movement. Civil rights are basic rights that every citizen in America has under the laws of the government, and they are protected by the Constitution in the United States. Civil rights give us the right to privacy, religion, assembly, free speech, a fair trial, and freedom of thought. Civil rights leaders put their lives in grave danger when they fought for their own rights as well as for others' rights. One of these civil rights movements was for racial equality, which lasted for over 100 years and began after the Civil War. When most people talk about the civil rights movement, they are referring to the protests in the 1950s and 1960s that led to the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Three of its leaders that paved the way for nonviolent protests were Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Booker T. Washington, and Rosa Parks, and these nonviolent protests led to changes in the law. The abolitionist movement was the beginning of the Civil War movement. The abolitionists were people who thought slavery was morally wrong, wanted it to end, and assisted many enslaved people to freedom through their organization. After the Civil War was over and the 13th Amendment freed the enslaved people, a lot of the southern states still treated the enslaved people very bad. They implemented laws that kept white people and black people separate. Remember, these laws were called the Jim Crow laws, but it was so much more than that. The schools, neighborhoods, hospitals, restaurants, and even the transportation for the black people were not as good. The government did not invest as much money, if any money at all, in the systems that supported the black communities. They were being kept separate with laws that kept them away from equal access to education, transportation, housing, and even medical care. The schools didn't have good books, and some of the schools in the black neighborhoods didn't even have any books at all. Some of these Jim Crow laws even kept black people from voting. In the early 1900s, some of the first protests occurred in response to the Jim Crow laws that southern states were implementing to enforce segregation or unequal access to education, medical treatment, and transportation. W.E.B. Du Bois and Ida B. Wells were only two of the many black Americans who protested the Jim Crow laws, and these two joined together to found the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, which is the NAACP. One of the other black leaders who focused on educating black Americans in order to improve their status in society by helping to form schools was Booker T. Washington. The civil rights movement gained momentum in 1950 when the Supreme Court ruled that school segregation was illegal and that black and white students should be able to go to school together, or more importantly, that black students would have access to the same level of education as white students. This 1950 court ruling overturned the United States Supreme Court decision of 1896 that ruled that it was legal for schools to be segregated. This lawsuit was called Brown versus Board of Education and was brought to the Supreme Court in 1954. The lawyer that won the case while representing the black Americans was named Thurgood Marshall. Even though the new law said that it was okay for black students to go to white schools or the better schools, some schools in the South still did not allow black students to attend the schools that white students attended. One of these schools that did not allow black students was Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. A local leader of the NAACP named Daisy Bates got together 9 black students to enroll at Central High, and these students became known as the Little Rock Nine. Their first day of school was September 4th, 1957, but when they arrived at the school, the white students were yelling at them, the neighbors were yelling at them, and the white students' parents were yelling at them to go away. There were also soldiers blocking the doors because the governor of Arkansas had deployed the soldiers to prevent black students from attending the school, which means he went against the Supreme Court's order. The students went home, but they came back. When they returned, President Eisenhower had sent the United States Army to Little Rock, Arkansas to escort the black students into the school. Even with the Army protecting them, it was still very difficult, and only one of the 8 black students made it to the end of the school year. Although this was a difficult year for the students known as the Little Rock Nine, they helped to desegregate the public schools in the South. Their brave actions encouraged other students to step forward in the years to come. The 1950s and the early 1960s brought about several key events in the civil rights movement. On December 1st, 1955, in Montgomery, Alabama, Rosa Parks was taking the bus home from work, and she was very tired. She had worked all day. The bus started to fill up, and she was told to move further back in the bus so white people could sit down. But she was tired after working all day, and she was tired of being treated as though she was not as important as white people. Because of her decision not to get up and give her seat to a white person, she was arrested, and her decision started a protest against segregation. Black people boycotted the buses 4 days later on December 5th, 1955, and did not ride the buses again for the next 381 days. This boycott brought the subject of racial segregation to the forefront of American politics, and a lawsuit was filed against the racial segregation laws. On June 4th, 1956, the laws were determined to be unconstitutional. The boycott had worked, and now black people were allowed to sit anywhere they wanted to on the bus. The civil rights movement was an effort to bring the issues of legal discrimination like school segregation, lower wages, and job discrimination to the attention of lawmakers and to the attention of the nation. One very large event that took place was the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom in 1963. The march was peaceful and hoped to bring the issues of unfair treatment and job discrimination to the forefront of Washington politics. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was one of the leaders of the march. Between 200,000 and 300,000 people showed up to the march, and they marched down the streets of the city and gathered between the Washington Monument and the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. There were also performances by Marian Anderson, Mahalia Jackson, Bob Dylan, and Joan Baez. However, the keynote and final speech was given by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and it was the I Have a Dream speech, which became one of the greatest speeches in history. In his speech, he spoke of his dream of a time where all people would be treated equally, regardless of race. When the march was over, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. met with President Kennedy to discuss upcoming civil rights legislation. Less than 1 year after this march, the Civil Rights Act was signed into law on July 2nd, 1964, by President Lyndon B. Johnson. This law outlawed segregation and the Jim Crow laws of the South and outlawed discrimination based on race, national background, and gender. Another very important law was passed in 1965, which was the Voting Rights Act, which said that citizens could vote regardless of race. It also outlawed literacy tests and poll taxes in order to vote. While discrimination continues still today, these two measures represented the most significant legislative successes in the 20th century struggle for racial equality before the law. Hello again. It's time for the yoga session, and I'm going to demonstrate 3 yoga poses, and I hope you are doing these yoga poses with me. The first one is named Warrior One, and it symbolizes overcoming ignorance. The second one is named Mountain, and it symbolizes standing still in steadiness, upright, straight, and unmoved. And the third one is named Tree, and it symbolizes staying rooted in your power, although you're moving with the wind. All 3 of these poses reflect upon the lesson today, because no matter what came their way and our way, how we will stand strong, overcoming ignorance, and stay rooted in our power. Okay, here goes.
Okay, it's time for the question. And the question for today's lesson is, if your parents left money on the table for ice cream and you have a brother or sister and you know that your brothers or sister like to cheat, they want to steal some of the money, don't want to give you your fair share, how are you going to get your fair share so you can buy some ice cream too? Are you going to protest, tell your parents, run away from home, beat them up? What are you going to do and how are you going to handle this situation? All right, discuss it with your grown up. And next week, when you come back, that will be our last lesson, number 6, and I'll be discussing the political climate of today and probably the protests also. But the main thing I want to focus on is constructive conversations, how to facilitate constructive conversations. So I'll be discussing a lot of terms that you hear coming up today and try to explain those terms so we can facilitate constructive conversation, so we can talk to each other, so we can be on the same page. It's very difficult to have a conversation when it feels like you all are speaking 2 different languages. Okay, enough talking. Go through the week, have a great week, always and forever. Keep your heads up, and I'll see you next week. Have a great night. Bye.